Thank you very much. That is the best way to save 1 minute of time. Good afternoon, everyone. After this magnificent story shared by my colleague here, by the way, I see you after what, 15 years? I wonder, just like many of us, it is possible. I mean, who of us can still live mystically or magically? I mean, who of us can live in the mystery of life? Heidegger proposed that the aspiration of human beings was to become that ideal type called Dasein, who is defined by the limit of existence, which means being for death. But just like Homero expressed, there are many ways to be for death. There are many ways to live life, knowing that oneself is mortal, or understanding life from that part of existence. And I wonder, just like I have wondered for the past few years, if it is possible to change the way to perceive a human being as a being for death and start thinking about being within life. The crisis of the planet, the destruction of the planet, the environmental crisis, puts us face to face with an unprecedented situation in the life of the planet, which is not the finiteness of life itself, but before the scenario of the finiteness, the potential finiteness of life. When we talk about the limits of growth, we ask ourselves where the limits of life are. And when we talk about survival, before what significant are we? What significance are we facing? Survival as a resistance of human life before the harassment or the battlement of this mode of intervention over life, against life, that has been implemented throughout history, throughout metaphysics, throughout human life, and that has come to set up this world that's guided, submitted, dominated by that wealth of power, which is the rationality of modernity, the economic rationality, technological rationality, which means out of two tremendous Prometeic moments that only promise death because they have no way to contain their impulse in a way that Earth cannot contain. And like the Ranchero song says, just like you, just like me, we cannot fit it inside our body. So survival presents to us nowadays as something that means a limit, but it's a limit that's not it doesn't suffice with saying it. We have to live it, we have to understand it, and we have to place ourselves in front of that limit, not only the limit of human existence, but of the time of life and the way to live individual life, but also about understanding what we were doing with the life of the planet. Understanding life is not what humanity has done, and let alone in this stage of modernity. The story of philosophy, the history of philosophy has been around understanding the self. But Heidegger complained about the self because I forget about life, because the environmental crisis is the historic effect of not understanding the conditions of life deeply, and not having learned to inhabit the planet under the conditions of the planet's life. So surviving nowadays is not just about resisting that attack, to somehow preserve life in poverty, in the limits of existence, in forced migration, in forced readaptation, in extreme poverty. It's about learning or comprehending life to reinvent life. So this is a confrontation against the position of what the limits are for the survival of the planet's life. It's been said that humanity can disappear, but that the cockroaches and microbia will always be there, they will be left there, or molecules themselves with the capacity to reorganize themselves, to revive, to recuperate life. So what we're facing is that we know that a lot of the defense of the environment has to do with defending biodiversity, the forms of life, giving nature its rights, the natures of rights. Deep ecology is moving in that direction, and many of us think that every form of life deserves living. But we're also facing the matter of having to understand to what extent this excessive intervention of the techno-economic regime of a planet is leading us to such a degradation of the conditions of resilience, which means it is invading, it is breaking the tissue of ecosystems, of the biosphere itself. To what extent are we implementing the law of entropy as the law of economic profit, economic growth, that can lead to the degradation of resilience, or of that constitution of the biosphere that will trigger a process that can really lead to the loss of life in the planet, an erosion, a planetary erosion, if you will, desertification. We have seen that happen in this history of our planet, even in our recent history. Remember when the environmental crisis broke out, remember everything that has happened, and then poverty generated by those technological intervention processes that have been improperly conceived, that have resulted in desertification. When Nietzsche said, as an allegory, that the desert grows, he was thinking about nihilism, he was thinking about the desert of the soul. Now we see that allegory becoming true. The desert is growing in actual fact. We're devastating the planet. We're destructuring ecosystems, everything from on which the capability of organization depend. I mean, the capability to recreate life itself, the creative evolution of life, as Bergson would say. So, we are before not only the survival of the broadest sectors of the human population who have been submitted to these regimes of exclusion, of poverty, or losing their know-how and their own existence, but we're also accelerating what, I don't know, as an allegory or scientifically, I have dared to name as the entropic life of the planet, beyond speculating whether the universe is guided by a process as the Big Bang towards the thermal death of the universe. On the planet, we're observing an entropic degradation process of the biosphere that could be thought of as a pathway to the entropic death of the planet. So vis-a-vis that, we ask ourselves whether economic degrowth, first of all, whether it is possible to limit the impulse of economic growth that has already been implemented in the constitution of economic rationality that governs the present world. If it is possible to put a ceiling or a limit to that process of growth, beyond the fact that the economic system itself is self-regulating through its own crises and it establishes the limits of the potential growth of the economic system itself. I think that what the humanity is facing now is a re-understanding of life. If it's the means of understanding of the human being, the different cultures, now that has become a hegemonic regime that somehow unifies or at least globalizes or results in a hegemonic force intervening the planet, and that what Vernadsky 1 century ago said, the biosphere is how the life of the planet structures. I mean, it's the pressure of life that gives shape to the planet, even in terms of its own geosphere conditions. Nowadays, it is not the pressure of life that's structuring the planet. It is the pressure of the techno-economic regime that's affecting economic life, that's destroying economic life. So to what extent can we nowadays take a historic spin to life in its way to understand it in these processes that are historic and that are cosmic? Because we're talking about the history of the planet, and of a planet that for eons constituted itself in this living planet that we're inhabiting because of its setup, because of its capacity to regenerate life, to constitute those mechanisms. That's the worst word to talk about life, but those modes of articulation of the ecosystemic complexity from where the resilience of the planet comes. Because if we didn't have it, that regime and the entropic death of the planet had already moved on at a larger scale, let's say. So we are facing, as I said, this cosmic thing, because it has to do with the history of this planet in the cosmos and what human beings are doing. I mean, that's the big dilemma of our historic moment. So vis-a-vis that, we ask ourselves, how can we learn to live under the conditions of life? And what are the conditions of life? The conditions of life, it's a thermodynamic and ecological condition. It's the way how atoms and molecules, cosmic molecules, started organizing themselves, and they resulted in life in this planet that prevail today in the behavior and in the dynamics of nutrients, of energy, ecological cycles of the biosphere. And one wonders whether the techno-economic regime, which means whether technology, in this impulse to expand itself according to capability to move on, I mean, technology whose progress is not possible to grab, and especially, and let alone when it is articulated to that other mechanism, which is the mechanism that's impulsed by the capitalistic production mode. Is there a way to subject that to an ethics that will moderate that growth, that triggering of that power of reason? Can technology do it? Can it be done by a regulation? Can economy become ecological? That's a challenge for economists, ecological economists. Or Are we facing how to rebuild that tissue that has to do with the means of production with the nature? I mean, the ecological conditions, the thermodynamic conditions of a territory of life. And that's what we're turning. I mean, from the hope that the government, economy, and technology will come to balance the planet, to take it to a stationary status within economic growth, to give it a spin towards a deconstruction of all that history of human rationalization of the planet. And then we try to comprehend the comprehension modes of those traditional peoples, those that I categorically call the peoples of the earth, who are those that, because for being symbolic beings, they don't have a mode of comprehension where in their minds, in their CK, or in their noesis, they see the reflection, the accurate and exact reflection of the ecological conditions of the territories they're inhabiting. The decay of the Mayan civilization could perhaps be a good example to see that will of power that Nietzsche talked about, also about the human being, not only becomes explicit and latent in modern capital, but it is inhabiting human beings. The will of power perhaps emerges from the depth of unconscious pulses of the human being, what Lacan called the lack of being. So it's not the deployment of being, but the lack of being of a human being that impulses to that impromptu, to that will to dominate. And that has exacerbated in the modernity regime, but that constitutes human beings. This is why when we talk about the conditions of life, we're talking about the thermodynamic and ecological conditions that sustain life ecologically, but we also have to think about the symbolic conditions of human beings, which is what human beings have to dominate in many ways. And where it is the traditional cultures who have, throughout their long existence and experience, the experience of life itself, they have been configuring their habits, their imaginary, their ways of being in the world. It is there where tremendous creativity emerges around cultural diversity and the hope that it'll be the peoples of the earth who will be capable of reinventing their modes of comprehension, to reinsert themselves, to reinhabitate their territories. Today we have emblematic examples that is possible, that is happening. The peoples of the earth are not asking for degrowth. I had the privilege some years ago to organize with a former student of mine. Well, but at the same time, she was the woman of the Vice Minister of Environment in Bolivia. So she organized an encounter that we named, innocently enough, sustainability from the imaginary of the indigenous peoples of Latin America. And in a dialogue of wisdom with them, when we talked about sustainability, they enlightened us and said to us, we do not want sustainability. Sustainability is a term that you have invented for yourselves to think that from there you will moderate your interventions on the earth. We want to live well. And somebody said, But the harassment of the world is such that it does not allow you to live well. Don't you want to live better? Even when living within your own cosmovision, within your own practices and your own knowledge, they said, no, we don't want to live better. Better is also another word of yours. The more, the better. That creates a difference between more and less. We want to live well. And then we started to realize that what we're facing is not something about adding norms or standards or limits to growth or to the dominant rationality. This is instead about opening up spaces in this planet to those other worlds of life, those that do not want to live towards growth, but who want to harmonize their existence as per the conditions of their lives. And they've been practicing that with their own flaws, because let me say it again, this idea of correspondence between concept and the thing, the ideal of the representation of theory and reality, is an invention, a human invention, a modern invention from the Cartesian code and from the law of reasoning. There is a difference, a radical difference in the human constitution, the difference between real and symbolic, material and ideal. And they don't match, and we need to learn to live like that. We need to learn to know that we are living with this difference, with this disjunction. I mean, we're material beings, but we're symbolic beings. We are inhabited by the daimonic, but we need to learn to live with that and moderate it. And then let me go back. The peoples of the earth have that, and in Homero's stories, this is one of the many ways to see how you can live in these magical, mystical, symbolic worlds. But that's where the hope opens up, that humanity, in their cultural diversity, will relearn to live under those conditions. I said there are emblematic examples. Let me say one of them. I was say it because it is emblematic. The Jeringueros. Jeringueros learned to re-identify themselves. They adopted the name of the Siringa, the tree that gives them latex, that gives them life. From there, they invented their reserves, extractivistic reserves. They live a good living out of what they get from nature. In their territory, they have exchanges. They barter with communities, with local markets, with international markets. They use their technical know-how, but more in the sense of techne, the Aristotelic techne. What I mean is the technique, but the technique that does not subject the creative force of physis, but that adapts itself, that adapts to that force that emerges from life, that comes from that idea of Heraclitus of physis, that potence, that power that in modern terms we call negentropy, that in theory also contravening the scientific know-how that sometimes just is seen as the over-comprehension of how things happen in thermodynamic terms, let's say, and that would lead us to understand the thermal death of the universe, and perhaps within that the entropic death of the planet. The thermodynamics of life nowadays is being reconstituted from ecogene, from the idea of order that comes from chaos, but also taking us to the Schrödinger update about life in terms of negentropy, transformation of solar energy into living matter, and now the cosmology, the biothermodynamics speculate that beyond thinking that we're doomed to entropic death, we are doomed if we know how to deal with those processes towards the revitalization of life. They even think of the colonialization of life, because life emerges from the power of atoms. They tend to constitute certain conditions, not anything. This is why not every planet is a living planet. So vis-a-vis that, survival presents before us differently. If Nietzsche ever thought about the emancipation of the human subject as the Superman, now we can think of survival not as living in the limit of existence, but survival in terms of knowing how to adapt to the creative power of life, and by adapting as creative beings, about knowing how to live within that condition and being able to see a different future of life, first of all on this planet, and then perhaps in the universe. But that implies a radical change in the way we comprehend even history. History, from this point, cannot be, history, as Heidegger said, led or guided by the history of being, or history dominated by reason. Reason has failed. Reason is not the fundamental element that defines human nature, and it will not even be the way to lead the destination of life and to give sustainability to life. We will have to activate perception, intuition, the senses, together with reason, of course, so that this leads us to another rationality, to other rationalities, to a world that's not dominated by the hegemony of power and technological and scientific and legal reason. But we need to open up the course to that co-evolution of life, co-evolution biologically, ecologically, culturally, which means turning that diversification process of life in the planet into something that makes a planet that we can all share, which means respecting differences, the ethics of otherness, which means not submitting the others to my way to see things, to my way to understand. This is not just about the rights of nature per se, because nature, as I've said, nature cannot file a complaint, judicial complaint directly. It is the human beings who, from the vision of what we have to defend in nature, we will look to defend those rights, which are the rights of life, non-human life, animal life, and human life. And so, let us open a world of transformation to transform the means of production. Of course, we need to render economy as ecological as possible, but also open up other possibilities that do not necessarily come from capital and submitted work, objectified by the capital regime and the regime of science. But instead, it should be nature per se, nature as the physis, reappropriated in the modes of comprehension of the peoples of life, ethical policies that can actually allow for a way to coexist, where there is the right to exist and recreate their life for the peoples of the earth, and those who, from these instances, who are so urbanized, so intellectualized, those of us who will be willing to continue through those pathways in the history and creative evolution of the humanity, of life and earth and life. Thank you very much.